Hey, it's Zach, otherwise known as Grim Fandango on Discord, and I'm here today to talk to you about Arkham Dagsson cEDH once again. And I've got a specific topic for you I want to cover. I want to talk to you about hate bears, and I'm going to present a bit of a defense of why I think they're actually quite good in our deck. But before we get to that, I actually just want to answer a question. What even is the Arkham Dagsson deck? You know, Often the cEDH meta is described by three pillars. You've got Turbo, which wants to win the game by turn 1 or turn 2, or turn 3 at the latest. You've got Stacks, which deploys a lot of Stacks pieces to stop Turbo. And then you've got Mid-range Control, which tries to out mid-range, draw a lot of cards, have some engines, and then control the other two players so then it can win in the mid to late game. I don't really love this, but what this boils down to is essentially you've got things like Tim Necrom as Turbo, and then you've got Tim Necrom as mid-range control, and then you've got something weird like Alavir as Stacks. And the Turbo, they feel really good about themselves. They're big Giga Chads. They like to win really fast, and they don't like talking to people. And then you've got the mid-range control people who feel like Giga Chads who do like talking to people. And then you have Stacks people who just like rules and setting rules and then just playing their own game. And they don't really exist. They don't really do much. They're not really considered that relevant in the meta. Yet somehow they're still considered a pillar of the format. And then they go, Arkham, you play Stacks pieces. You're a Stacks deck. That makes sense, right? Right? And I think it just misses the point. So what is Arkham really? Before we answer that question, I'm going to do my ad read. So I founded an organization in Melbourne called the Melbourne cEDH League. We're basically an Australian-based tournament organizer. We're a non-profit organization that runs cEDH events that are proxy-friendly. And we do that by partnering with stores and running them on their behalf. But we also provide them top deck software to use for the event. However, top deck costs money. And we need to find ways to pay for that. So, this Melbourne cEDH League is a bit like the Smiling Friends, but for cEDH in Melbourne. And we love to look at different ways to raise revenue for our non-profit to just support the community in general. And one of the ways we've looked at for doing that is by partnering with Manifold Proxies. Now, Manifold Proxies is an American-based proxy maker. The person who founded it, his name is Notorious. He's part of the Arkham community. And it's a very American-grown business. And I hear the quality of the proxies are quite good. Unfortunately, I'm in Australia and we get hit by a lot of tariffs, so it's not always economical for us to buy things from the US. But if you are in the US, and you're interested in getting some proxies, there are some very expensive cards in the Arkham deck. Please consider using the affiliate link in the description of this video. Any kickback I get from that, I'm going to put straight into the Melbourne cEDH League to help cover our top deck expenses and things like that. So if you do that, you're just helping the Melbourne community, you're helping the cEDH community in general. And I really appreciate all of the work that Manifold Proxies has done to partner and work with us today. I'm not getting a kickback from this. This is just doing this as a labor of love for the community. Anyway, back to the rest of the video. So what is Arkham really? So Arkham is tempo, and you might be like, what's that? It's also a little bit Stacks, and you're like, ew, that's kind of gross. It's got a little bit of control thrown in there, and you're like, yeah, sure. And then there's a tiny itty bitty bit of mid-range, and then you're like, so what is your deck? I've got a friend in the Melbourne community. He likes to be the weather report person. He figures out what everyone's playing, and then he puts them into a bucket of Stacks, control, or Turbo, and he usually puts me in this weird Stacks bucket, and I'm just like, that's not really what the deck is, but it kind of is at the same time. But anyway, either way, putting the deck into a bucket like that kind of misses some of the point. So what I want to elaborate on here is that triangle of the pillars of the format, that's not necessarily a strategy. That's more like an archetype or a metagame breakdown. And it talks about how Turbo is a dominant strategy, and mid-range control is a dominant strategy, and in some extent Stacks is also a dominant strategy. But part of the problem is that most good decks don't have stacks as their core game plan, especially not since like the year 2016. Like back then, stacks was more relevant, and to some extent in the dockside meta, stacks was a little bit more relevant as well. But these days, stacks as a core game plan is pretty rare to see. It's still around for sure, but like generally, stacks isn't your core game plan. It's just something that some decks happen to do. Um, so like lumping decks into these different buckets like this, like for turbo and mid-range control, I think those really are good things to do. But like at the same time, not every mid-range deck is a control deck. Not every turbo deck is purely turbo. Like there's a lot of like fluidity between these archetypes, and putting them, not everything fits neatly in these buckets. So like getting down to that, like the distraction makers have like put out a video a while ago now. It's a pretty old video, and it's kind of talking about the fundamentals of strategy in a trading card game. And instead of talking about archetypes and cEDH, I think it's actually better we bring this back to like the fundamentals of different strategies, and from there we can explore things about what the Arkham deck is doing and how hate bears and stacks and other things fit into that. So the strategy cycle, like invented by the Distraction Makers channel, it essentially describes what cards and decks actually do, rather than finding some archetypes and then just drawing some squiggly lines between them that don't even make sense. Because, for example, like, does turbo beat mid-range control? Does stacks beat turbo? Does mid-range control beat stacks? I don't know. Like, it's actually, people act like this is like some gospel, but it's really just a bunch of vibes that people made up a while ago and then forgot to update, and then they just try and apply that on everything. And like it doesn't really make sense. So that's why I want to bring this back to basics. So there are three pillars or three different touch points of the strategy cycle. You've got rush at the top, you've got economy, and then you've got defense. Now I know these terms are not the terms you're going to be used to, and we'll kind of bring this back to terminology that Magic will understand. But let's talk about rush first. So rush, if you think about it, their goal is to do things to proactively win the game quickly. So in 1v1 formats, you might have things like aggro. In cEDH, you might be thinking more like a combo-based strategy, but like generally speaking, most cEDH decks are combo-based. It's just about when they plan to combo off, which is the question. Rush generally wants to combo earlier rather than later. So like that might fit more into like turbo, but then tempo sort of leans a little bit into what rush is. And Arkham, I believe, is more of a tempo deck than a pure rush deck. So generally speaking, rush, it's faster than economy. It can deploy a win before those economy and mid-range based strategies can get their wins online. However, it's weaker to defense-based strategies because they put all of their eggs in trying to win early, and they also they put all their eggs in that they often can't survive if they get interacted with too much. So like some decks, the examples of like rush-based decks are like Crick, Rel, and you've got like Underworld Breach. They're just some examples of that. So that's a bit about rush. They've got a great early game. They're faster than economy, weak to defense, but they suffer in the long game once they get interrupted. And then you've got economy. So economy is like the opposite. They have a bit more of a weaker early game in some ways, but they prioritize the scaling potential of cards. If you think about something like Dark Ritual, it's one card that gives you 3 mana for one phase of the game. Whereas you compare that to like Rhystic Study, a card that just generates you multiple cards throughout the game. The scaling potential of Rhystic Study is a lot higher than the scaling potential of something like Dark Ritual. And that makes Rhystic Study more of an economical card. So like economy decks focus on the scaling potential of cards and getting these engines online so they can outvalue opponents over time. So examples of this are like mid-range or mid-range control. And generally speaking, economy decks, they have a resource advantage. They are stronger against defense-based strategies, especially ones that favor counterspells. Because if you use your one counterspell to stop an economy deck, and stopping one of their engines, they might still have several other engines going, and they still have a longer game plan. And while you've spent your one resource to deal with one of their threats, they've got a threat generating machine, meaning that they'll probably be able to survive in the long game. I know that description kind of makes more sense in terms of 1v1, and you might be squinting and saying that doesn't really work in cEDH, and it doesn't. And we'll get into why those kind of analogies don't necessarily fit perfectly, especially if you're thinking about archetypes. Because in the reality is, like, most of the time, defense and economy are paired together, so that those decks that are trying to interact with other people, when they spend a resource to interact with someone else, they're also gaining resources using their resource engine so that they don't run out of resources to keep controlling. So that's a little bit about economy, and generally speaking, economy is stronger against pure defense, but they are slower than rush, and they win the long game. Then we have defense. So this focuses purely on interrupting or preventing an opponent's game plan. Think counterspells, removal, and stacks pieces. And in this case, a pure control deck or pure defense deck, it's like aiming to just go 1-for-1 with things. Use its counterspell to stop someone's important threat, and then maybe it'll survive long enough to do its long-term plan. Which is good if it's going against just a rush deck, but the economy of an economy deck is going to have a better and stronger long game than the defense deck. So some example archetypes are control or mid-range control. You've got stacks, and you've got tempo. We're going to get more into this a little bit later, but it's worth noting that there are two different flavors of defense. There's like defense where you go 1-for-1, which is like a counterspell or Into the Floodmaw. And then you've got things like Damping Sphere, which is something that has like a rule-setting long-term effect that blends a little bit of economy and defense together. Generally speaking, the reactive defensive strategies are strong against rush because they'll be able to interrupt them at a critical moment in time. But they are outvalued long-term by mid-range. Though if a control deck can control and counter an important piece of the mid-range engine, then there's a chance the defense can get out from underneath it. So, what's tempo? Is it defense or is it rush? I would argue that tempo is a blend of defense and rush. What we've described, Arkham isn't a mid-range deck. It's not a very good mid-range deck at all. It doesn't have tutors that can consistently get it to some engines like Rhystic Study, like other decks like Tymna Kraum, and it does not have a Tymna in the command zone. Generally speaking, Arkham struggles to draw cards, and because we can our deck is where we want our important pieces to be for tutor targets, we often prefer it that way. But generally speaking, tempo is more of an archetype in cEDH. It blends from rush and it blends from defense, much like mid-range control takes from economy and defense strategies. So it values efficient use of resources, and timing of those resources matters. So for example, the parts of tempo that are like rush for Arkham is where we use our fast mana to get out Arkham early, so we can start activating in the early turns and using Arkham's ability in a defensive or in a proactive way. So it has a consistent game plan it's trying to achieve as quickly as possible, which is to deploy Arkham early and then to have artifact creatures online so it can then activate Arkham. And it uses the stacks pieces and control cards to deal with important threats so it can survive the long game and long enough to execute its plan. So that's where it goes with defense. So like sometimes, someone tries to like win on turn 1 or turn 2, and generally Arkham, it's aiming to win by turn 3 or 4 or later. It can win early, but generally it's trying to win it's trying to win in the mid game. That's generally where it's trying to be. And it's not a mid-range deck. It's trying to win on the earlier side of the mid game, like turn 3 or 4, rather than the later side of the mid game, which is like 4 or 5. But it's it uses control to survive into the mid game, and it also uses control to protect its own win attempts and to protect its own things. It's expending a lot of resources to get out Arkham early a lot of the time, and a lot of the time it's using its counter spells to protect that investment. So that's also a part of defense, is to protect your own strategy, not just interrupting other people's strategies. So that's a bit about tempo. And now let's talk about mid-range control. So mid-range control is a great pairing. It's another blended archetype from the strategy circle. It uses the engines to get consistent means of interaction like Rhystic Study, and then it uses things like Smothering Tithe to get consistent access to mana to cast its counterspells. And if done well, mid-range control does not run out of resources once the engines are running. And that's why Slop is good. You know, it's a deck that can really have it all once it's got set up. And that's why you're seeing things like Rogish Shy dominating the meta right now. So a question you might be asking is like, why are we weak to Slop? Well, Arkham uses it. Arkham has a plan to get its Arkham out early. The deck using fast mana, and so like things like Mana Vault, Grim Monolith, things like that, or Lotus Petals, like things of that nature, where it's like a one-off. And if this gets interrupted, we often struggle. You know, Arkham costs 4 mana, and you've got to wait a whole turn cycle before you can activate it again if you don't have a haste enabler. So like our plan can be interrupted, and when you look at our deck in that way, it feels a little bit more like a rush deck rather than a control or mid-range deck, because our plan is easier to interrupt than something that's more mid-range focused. And also, from a control perspective, like unlike a mid-range control deck, which has ways to consistently replenish its resources, when we use our counterspells, they are like precious treasures. You know, once we've used one, often we are taking a turn off sometimes to hold up that blue mana we need to do to stop an early push from another turbo deck. Or in some cases, that's the only counterspell we're ever going to see in the entire game. If we're using it there, that's the only time we've used it. So like a lot of the time, we rely on either our counterspells or an Arkham activation to stop a threat. So, and if the Slop is preventing us from like consistently getting our Arkham plan online, then we're relying purely a lot more on our counterspells to be defensive. And for Rogue Ishai's case, they just have more counterspells than us, and they've just got more consistent access to ways to interrupt us, and they'll be able to replenish their resources more quickly than us. So that's why Rogue Ishai and the Slop decks are generally speaking more favored in the matchup to us. If you look at this circle, generally where the arrow is pointing is where the thing beats the thing. You know, mid-range control sits here, and we sit here. So like their arrow points towards ours, and therefore it's like more like effective against beating us. You know, they win the resource war. We can't afford to go 1-for-1 on too many counterspells because we just simply don't have access to enough of them. You know, there are games where we do get a Rhystic Study online, but we just don't consistently have access to that, and it's not something we generally mulligan for. So yeah, our counterspells, while good against things like Turbo, aren't great against mid-range control, and especially not Slop. And we will often get outvalued by economy-focused decks. So if that's the case, how can we win the resource war? How can we win the resource war? How can we beat the Slop? To do that, I think we've got to think about how each card fits into the strategy circle. Rather than thinking purely in terms of decks, we need to look at the cards themselves. So like if you look at a card like Rhystic Study, it's a purely economical card. It draws you a lot of cards. You know, it can be used obviously to help you find the win eventually, but like purely on the face of it, it's just an economy card. It's a card that draws you lots of cards. You know, it has that scaling factor. If you have a look at a counterspell like Force of Will or Pact or whatever, it's a defense card. It goes 1-for-1 to stop someone else's threat. You know, if you look at a card like Dark Ritual, it's purely a rush card. You know, it's one card right now to get a burst of mana, which you can use now, and then once you've used it, it's gone. So those are like some key typical examples of cards and how they fit on the strategy circle. But what about this? Portal to Phyrexia. You know, if you look at Portal to Phyrexia, what is it? How does that fit on the strategy circle? First of all, it removes your opponent's creatures. It neutralizes their threats. So in that way, it's a defensive card. It also reanimates creatures and gives you consistent access to food. So in that way, it's an economy card. And if food is critical and crucial to our tempo game plan, in some ways you consider that something it's more rush leaning because it gives us access to something the deck really needs, which is food. To support our tempo game plan. So it's a card that sort of does all three in a way, but it's mainly a defense and economy card. Now let's consider this card, Nexus of Becoming. It draws us cards and creates food. In that way, it's an economy card, and because it creates food and can be used to deploy some very important things for our game plan, you can also look at it like a rush card to an extent. It's very good at supporting our tempo game plan. And then what about this? Okay, this is Force of Will. Bringing this full circle again. This deals with an important threat and can be used to protect our win, but it doesn't scale. It's not economical, and Slop will beat this. You can't stop. You can only stop one turbo deck with a Force of Will. You can't stop two. And the best case scenario is you get a draw. Now, if you look at something else in the defense category, what about this? You've got Damping Sphere. It stops multiple opponents and multiple different strategies from winning the game and advancing. It turns off Gaia's Cradle, and it also stops storm decks like Breach from working. And the best thing about it compared to something like Force of Will is that unlike Force of Will, which can only neutralize one threat at one instance in the game, this is a continuous effect. It enables you to stop multiple opponents. It has that scaling potential. So in that way, I actually consider Damping Sphere or Stacks pieces to be a blend of defense and economy, because they have this economical way to defend. So yeah, that scaling potential makes this really cool. And through cards like Damping Sphere, I believe we can outvalue the mid-range control slop strategy, because we have a way to neutralize the value of their engines in some ways and make them have to pay their taxes. It's not a perfect strategy, but in theory, Stacks is in some ways the answer to the mid-range control problem, because their control is usually spell-based rather than permanent-based. So if you can neutralize the way for them to cast spells and take off their value, that's a great way, in a scalable way like this, in a reusable way that means we don't consistently burn through resources that we don't have. That's a better way to neutralize that economy strategy. So what if we could have a card that does it all? Does all three? Is economy, is defense, and is rush. Also, wasn't this video meant to be about hate bears? Okay. So, what about this? This is Soulless Jailer. This card says permanent, it's an artifact creature. It's a Phyrexian Golem. It says permanents in graveyards can't enter the battlefield. Players can't cast non-creature spells from graveyards or exile. So, it, like Damping Sphere, it stops an opponent from winning the game, which is defense, and it stops multiple opponents from winning with the same resource, so it has that scaling power of economy. And because it's Arkham food, it can be used to win the game, so it fits into that rush strategy. So yeah, it's food. That's kind of the answer. That's how we can have cards that do it all. Is you find, Stacks pieces that are defensive and that are food. That's how you get a card that does all three things. So if it's so good, what's the downside? Well, Arkham is a toolbox deck. Part of the way that Arkham plays control or defense is by activating to find necessary and relevant Stacks pieces to interrupt certain win attempts. That's how Arkham works. When you're holding up an Arkham activation, you're signaling to your opponents, hey, you better have a way to stop the Arkham activation, otherwise you're not going to be able to win. But the problem with something like Soulless Jailer is that Arkham can only find non-creature artifacts with its activation. So Soulless Jailer is useless if you're relying purely on this to stop a Breach deck. So that's why you often see cards like Grafdigger's Cage make the cut and not Soulless Jailer. Hate Bears aren't usually tutorable. Okay, so if that's the case, why am I running both? Well, first of all, I run both because you need to be able to consistently have a tutorable version of a Cage effect. Cage is also 1 mana versus 2. And I seem to have not finished this slide properly. So to answer this question properly, I need to delete this slide because it's not relevant, and then we'll go to the next one. So why am I running it? Well, consider this pod. In seat 1, you've got Crick. In seat 2, you've got Ral. In seat 3, you've got Rowan. And seat 4, you've got Arkham Dagsson. What's the common theme with all these opponents? They all want to win by like turn 2 or turn 3 at the latest. They're all turbo decks. And they're all greedy AF. You know, and when you're in a pod like this and you're in seat 4, you've got 2 real options that you can do. Option A is find and deploy a meaningful defense/stacks piece early. And to do that, you need to mulligan to find it. Or B, find a hand that gives you an early Arkham activation. In this case, it has to be by turn 2. Like, you have to be able to activate on turn 2, no later, otherwise you're just dead. It's either, and with that activation, you need to find a way to lock everybody out. So in the end of the day, A and B are essentially the same. It's either find a stacks piece and cast it in your early game, or get Arkham out early and then activate early to get that stacks piece. Those are your 2 options. And in general, A I found to be hard, and B I found to be harder. You know, counterspells may work, but they also may not work. In the case of Crick, you may have a Crick that goes, well, are you going to cast it? When you say, I've got this counterspell, if I stop you, then Ral is just going to win on their turn. And then you ask Ral and you say, hey Ral, would you agree to a draw? And they go, sure. And then you go, Rowan, hey, would you agree to a draw? And they're like, sure. And then you ask the Crick and they say, no, I don't agree to the draw. So like, often what will happen, and I've noticed this with turbo players, is that they are less happy with draws than they are with losses. So, and maybe that's just a person thing, I'm not sure. But in general, like, people who play turbo are generally, they don't like to engage with the negotiating aspect of the game as much. They don't like making deals. They just want to play their game and do their game plan. And that's why you may find a turbo player less inclined to come to the table when it comes to a draw. And if they don't agree to the draw, then you're still losing anyway. So, like, so at best case scenario, when you're dealing with using a counterspell as your way to deal with a pod like this, your best outcome is a draw, which sucks. I mean, draws are better than nothing, but it's not great. And the reality is, stacks, if you can find a stacks piece that locks everyone out of the game, then that's realistically your only path to victory. If you can find a way to deploy a stacks piece early that interrupts all of their game plans, then you've essentially got a way forward to get to that mid game and then hopefully survive long enough to win. So that's kind of a long-winded way to say why I'm running the hate bears. But generally what I'm getting at is, you need, like, in these scenarios, you need to find these answers in your mulligans. You can't be relying on an Arkham activation to get you out of this bind. You need to have a hit in your deck that's relevant to all of these. And to do that, you need to just have more defensive cards in your deck. But the reality is, we don't have enough slots to just run all of the slop. The reason why slop is good, and I've seen a lot of Arkham pilots lately experimenting with things like the 10 rings and stuff like that, and they'll go LED into 10 rings. And that's cool, but the problem with the LED 10 ring strategy is that's a good way to get you back in the game, but if you're relying on the 10 rings to help you survive to turn 3, it's probably not a good out for you, because our deck isn't like a slop deck. It's not running 30 counter spells. It's not running 10 pieces of removal. You know, our deck runs like maybe 13 or 14 pieces of meaningful instant speed interaction. So, like, you're just not going to find a lot of the answers you need at the right time if you're relying on some sort of engine to get you there. Um, so, like, our defense, but what we can do, and the reality is, we just can't afford, even if we have the desire to run all of that, we just can't afford to sacrifice that many slots to the slop counterspell war because, like, you know, we just, A, we can't consistently get our engines, and B, we can't consistently to either draw those cards and get the mana, and B, even if we did do that, we just wouldn't have enough slots to do our normal game plan, which is to run the 20 artifact creatures we need to actually do the Arkham thing consistently. So, Hate Bears is like a nice middle ground for me because I found that I don't have infinite slots to just carve out for non-creature stacks pieces. But like if I have like an Arkham food in my deck, you know, my choices are like it's either going to be a dork to give me more mana, or it's going to have something really splashy, powerful effect, like say Crashing Drawbridge or Marvin, or it's just going to win me the game like Filigree Sages. Outside of that, you've got your zero cost dorks that are like your zero cost creatures, which are really just there to pad out slots and give you more explosive potential. So like there is a little bit of room, and like I was thinking, well, what if I just took one of those slots that wasn't really doing much of anything and just replaced that with a defensive card like Soulless Jailer? That way, I can add more defense to my deck without compromising really on the core strategy of the Arkham game plan. So that's like my thesis here around why I like Hate Bears. It's centered around mulligans. You know, it's like it's coming from this idea of sometimes I have these games where I just need to be able to find answers. And the more answers I have in my deck, the more likely I will find them in my mulligans. I can't afford to sacrifice slots on more counter spells because then I'm going to compromise on the rest of the toolbox of the deck, which the deck needs to function and work. And so like what that leaves me is things like Hate Bears. So that's kind of how I arrived at this conclusion. Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. So hopefully I've sufficiently explained to you why Hate Bears makes sense, and maybe I've made you curious, and you're like, you've intrigued me with these Hate Bears. Surely there are many more good Hate Bears for me to run. The Hate Bears. There are exactly 3 Hate Bears that are playable in our deck that are worth considering. And they are Soulless Jailer, Phyrexian Revoker, and Rug of Smothering. There is technically like a few more, like Lodestone Golem and Silent Arbiter, but those cards, their effects are not worth their price of admission. These 3 are the only ones you consider, and really, I'd argue that there's only 2 worth considering here. And like of those 2, only one is actually genuinely good, and the other one is like worth trying at least. And you might be thinking, hey, what about Hope of Girapur, or you know that card from Aether Drift that's also a counterspell? And I'm like, those cards, while they are like defense, they blend defense and rush together because they are like creatures that can also be used as interaction. A lot of the way they do that is by sacrificing themselves. So like it's sort of like you end up losing on the economy of them. And then while they are things you should consider, I think like the reality is like a lot of the ones that I looked at, they're not that great at stopping your opponent's win attempts. And they can't be deployed early. So these are the 3 that I actually think are worth thinking about for right now. So let's talk about Soulless Jailer first. What does it stop? So first of all, it stops Breach because you can't cast cards from graveyards. It stops Ral because Ral often exiles and rummages a lot, and it also likes to cast cards from graveyards. So that's Ral would really struggle to win if it can't cast from graveyards or from exile. It stops Atali because Atali flips don't work. It stops Food Chain, which is in Atali. It stops Tyam because like permanent cards in graveyards can't enter the battlefield. So unlike Grafdigger's Cage, which only stops the creature half of a Tyam activation, this just says a Tyam activation doesn't work. Like it just completely neutralizes the Tyam activation. So the only out that a Tyam has under a Jailer, besides removal, is a Shifting Woodland or a Necrotic Ooze, which is a much smaller window for them to crawl through. In some ways, it does stop Crick, but if they're going for a reanimation strategy. But a lot of times, Cricks, especially in my local meta, they know their way around my deck, and they often go for things like Necrotic Ooze anyway, so it doesn't really stop Necrotic Ooze. But it does stop Lumra, because Lumra does a lot of reanimation of lands and things like that. It's not perfect, you know. Lumras can get around this using using Root Path Purifiers and Talon Gates and things like that, but it's a much bigger struggle for them. It stops Rakdos because Rakdos does a lot of exiling. It stops Obnix for the same reason. And it does stop a fair bit of Tim Nadago stuff, although I would argue that Tim Nadago can definitely still win through a Soulless Jailer. It's just another window for them to crawl through before they get to that win. Outside of that, like looking at the stat line, it's a 2 mana 0/4. That's a great rate. You know, it can block a Ragavan. And it won't die to a single OBM ping. So generally speaking, the quality of this card is just really up there. It's not perfect by any means, but it's really solid. And another thing, if you do need to get a portal to Phyrexia, you can always just sacrifice the Jailer and then reanimate the Jailer back again to get what you need. So like there are like interesting like side benefits to it being a creature here, in that you can have more ways to sacrifice it. Okay, so what's the next one? So Phyrexian Revoker is the next one. Let's start with the card itself. This is a 2 mana artifact creature, Phyrexian Horror. It's basically a Pithing Needle creature version. So it says, when it enters, name a non-land card. That's a downside, you can't name lands for some reason. And then it says, activated abilities of the chosen name can't be activated. So, downside, it's clear. It's a 2/1, it'll die to an OBM ping. That being said, OBM is only 1 card in our deck, and it'll die to gut shots and things like that, so that does suck. And it can be easily cloned, and when they clone it, they're obviously going to name Arkham, because why wouldn't they? That being said, if they are going to try and clone it, you may have a window to interact with that by sacrificing it in response. So they try and cast a Mockingbird, and they pay X equals 1, which is enough for the Phyrexian Revoker. And then you go, oh, I'm going to respond to that by sacrificing my Phyrexian Revoker. So that's like something you can do. You've got an out for that, unlike something like Pithing Needle, where when they clone it, you've gotten your crap out of luck unless you've got a... to be fair, if you're on KCI and they do a Pithing Needle and they try and clone your Pithing Needle, you could just, in response, go get KCI. But then that does feel pretty bad, because you're using one activation just to stop their activation. So that can be a bit rough. So you're using one activation to stop their play, and then you're kind of going down. Whereas in the case of Phyrexian Revoker, you can still activate and get whatever you need to progress your game plan versus just something that stops you from bricking. So that's Phyrexian Revoker. One of the upsides is that because they put that name restriction on there, which is like non-land card, it means that they were able to get a little bit crazier. And this is like one of the only flute style effects that turns off mana abilities. And that's quite powerful. That means that Phyrexian Revoker can stop breach lines, because you can name LED, and while they can get the LED back from the graveyard, they can't activate it. You can use it to stop Kinnan, although I'd argue why would you? Because Kinnan, unless you're against big flips, Kinnan don't really care about the Kinnan activation. They're just sort of doing that for value. But you could name Kinnan with it. You can name Cabbage Man. Even though it's a mana ability, it turns off mana abilities. You know, it can stop Food Chain, because you can name Food Chain and they can't use Food Chain. It can stop Crick, because you can name things like Blood Celebrant. Although I'd argue that if you're naming Blood Celebrant, you're probably just dead a different way. Crick is just going to use a different tutor to do a different thing. You can name Thrasios and turn off Thrasios, which is cool. You can name Tyam and just stop a Tyam from Tyaming. It can stop Tivit because you name Time Sieve. It can stop Rel because you name Rel's ass, like the underside of Rel, so they can't do the Rel thing. You know, it can stop Treasonous Ogre. It can stop Necropotence. It can also stop Rowan. There's a lot of abilities that are relevant. It can't stop lands. But like that doesn't matter. And like it's quite interesting though, because there are some decks that rely not necessarily on Cradle, but Cradle style creatures like Brigid. Like Brigid is an example of that, where it's a Cradle deck that doesn't need Cradle because it's got Cradle in the command zone. So, but Phyrexian Revoker can shut down Brigid as well. So that's Phyrexian Revoker. The downside is real. You know, it can be easily cloned, and you have to worry out about that. And it is a 2-1. But that being said, we run a lot of like 1 toughness creatures in our deck anyway, and that's just a reality we accept. That's one of the weaknesses of our deck. Okay, moving along. We've got Rugged Smothering. So first of all, it's a 3-mana artifact creature construct. It's got flying, big whoop, and it says whenever a player casts a spell, they lose 1 life for each spell they've cast this turn. So it's sort of like a Aetherflux Reservoir, but in reverse. So, and in that way, I think of it a little bit like a Damping Sphere at home. And look, if there was an artifact creature version of Damping Sphere, I would absolutely run it, because that's arguably my most favorite stacks piece in the game of Magic itself. But there is a real downside. The one thing that's stopping me from running it is the fact that it's 3 mana instead of 2. The things I like about this card, why I would consider it, is that it is an anti-storm card. You know, every time they cast a spell, they have to pay a bunch of life, and they're eventually just going to kill themselves if they can't find a way to kill the rug first. You know, it does have a nice butt. It's chunky. It's like a 3 toughness butt. But the problem is, it being 3 mana means that it's hard to consistently deploy early. You know, if I'm going into those games, those hell pods, where I need to like have an early answer, I need that answer to be online by turn 2 at the latest. Otherwise, I'm just going to mulligan the hand away. And you're asking a lot from me to have a hand that can get to turn 3 mana very early. Essentially, you're going to need like a Soul Ring or some fast mana, and potentially that might be temporary fast mana, in order to deploy this early. So there's a lot of hoops to jump through when it comes to Rugged Smothering. This deck can consistently get to 2 mana relatively easily, but above 2 mana, it's a bit more of a struggle to get there by turn 2. Like by turn 3, usually you're at 4 mana. But by turn 2, you're usually stuck at 2 mana. It's this weird thing. And 3 mana is like that nowhere awkward zone. So like that's kind of what's holding me back here. But generally speaking, what Rugged Smothering stops is Breach, because like you're storming, Ral because you're paying too much life, so they'll kill themselves, Food Chain because again it's storm, Crick to some extent because they care about their life totals, although a lot of the time I think that this won't necessarily stop Crick, because Crick will find a way out before they kill themselves. They always do. It stops Adnors decks because you're pinging them down constantly for life, which means they can't draw as many cards. It stops Necro decks for the same reason. But again, if this was 2 mana, this would be a no-brainer. But at 3 mana, this is really hard. So what are my recommendations? I'm going to say Soulless Jailer is an all-star. The card is great. It doesn't stop everything. And the fact that it doesn't stop 2 field tutors, creature tutors, does suck. In that way, I think most of the time I will prefer a cage for that simple effect, because you know you can deploy a cage on 1 just for value against like those green decks, where that's what makes a cage worth it. That's what makes cage a good keepable card into those pods. Whereas like Soulless Jailer, it's really just about stopping like flashy things like Atalis and Food Chains and Breach wins. So it's like Soulless Jailer is great into those turbo pods. It's less good into those mid-range pods. But generally speaking, that doesn't matter. It's still great, and I still love it. It's a great card. It has its weaknesses for sure, but in some ways it's better than Cage, and in some ways it's worse. Revoker, this is a card I'm experimenting with and I'm trying. I haven't yet to cast it yet, but I think the thesis is sound. It's a 2-1, and I don't love that about it, but I'm also scared that someday it's going to get cloned and it's going to bite me in the butt. But I think at the rate of 2 mana, you could ask for a lot worse. It's still technically an out for an early Breach push, so I think that's kind of what makes it worth it for me. It being able to turn off mana abilities and things like that are really strong. And you might think, why am I crazy for running this instead of... I'm not on Disruptive Flute, and I'm not on Pithing Needle, but I'm on this for some reason. And that's just a slot issue. It was easier to find a slot for Hate Bear than it was to find a slot for a non-creature artifact stacks piece. And then Rug of Smothering, I'm saying no to. If this was 2 mana, I would probably run this, and I'd probably run it over a Revoker, maybe. But at 3 mana, it's just a little too expensive. It does not fit the criteria I need it for. It's not online when I need it, which is early by turn 2. And again, that's the framework and way you should be looking at these cards. They're not cards you tutor for, these are cards you mulligan for. And if you approach it with that mindset, these hate bears make a lot more sense than if you're thinking about them purely as a tutor target. Obviously, you can tutor for these using something like Repurposing Bay or like Cytanial Flute if you're on that still. But generally speaking, these are great mulligan targets and they're great to cast. You might ask after that, well, cool, that was a great rundown. I wish there were more stacks pieces like hate bears, but there aren't any more hate bears. No, sadly, there really aren't. There's Lodestone Golem and Silent Arbiter, but they're not worth talking about. They're both like 4 mana, and they don't really do enough in this format. You know, Lodestone Golem is essentially a it just makes your opponent's spells cost 1 more, which sucks. And then, which is okay, but it doesn't really stop enough wins. And then you've got another one, which is Silent Arbiter, which says your opponents can't attack you with more creatures than cards you have in your hand, which is like, that's also bad. Like, combat isn't really a dominant strategy, and when it is in cEDH, it's usually 1 creature going in with big damage. So, putting those hate bears aside, do you have anything else for me, you might ask? Well, Vexing Bauble's a great card, and this is a card we often overlook. And this is a card I've been experimenting with recently. Recently, I cut Misdirection for Vexing Bauble, and I think that's a cut I'm happy with making, because I'm taking it from the defensive part of my deck. I'm saying I'm trading a short-term, 1-for-1 defense piece, which was Misdirection, which I was already not very happy with. You know, I had a recent game where I was trying to Misdirection a freaking into Mental Misstep, and I couldn't do it. And I was like, well, you know, Misdirection is just so limited in what it can do. You know, it doesn't hit abilities, it just hits, it's essentially just a counterspell for someone else's counterspell, and that's it. And I think in our deck, I think that we can do a little bit better. You know, Vexing Bauble, by comparison, is a great card to mulligan for. You know, it's another card that stops Breach. It's another card that stops Atali. It's another card that stops Rel. It's another card that can potentially stop things like Rowan. There's a lot of like upside to Vexing Bauble compared to something like a Misdirection. So for me, that was a cut that I was really happy with making. And I think that if you're trying to find room for non-creature stacks pieces, that's kind of the mindset you've got to look at. You've got to be like, am I happy with the number of defensive tools that are in my deck right now? And if the answer is yes, then you need to look at, okay, am I happy with the defensive pieces that are there, and which ones am I least happy with, and then make a cut like that. You know, for a similar example, recently I added Invasion Submarine, and that's an amazing card, and I don't know why I wasn't on it sooner. You know, there's so much combo potential for that card, but outside of the combo potential, it's still, at the end of the day, a defensive card too, because it can be used as like interaction and removal, for onboard removal. So like what I traded out of my deck for that was I cut an offer you can't refuse. I took another piece from the defense part of my deck and I moved it to a better defensive card slot for what I'm dealing with. And right now we're in this sloppy global metagame where free interaction is really powerful. People are drawing a lot of cards. So I think in that way, you know, finding defensive cards that have a better economy side to them, I think is really important, and that's where things like Vexing Bauble are really strong and powerful. And look, I know and I'm aware there's anti-synergy with Vexing Bauble in our deck. You know, I also recently went up on LED. We've got free cards like Mox Opal, we've got Lotus Petal, we've got Chrome Mox, we've got like Phyrexian Walker, we've got Ornithopter, we've got Shield Sphere. All of these free spells are here, and plus we've got all these counter spells that are free as well. And look, I'm not saying that like the anti-synergy isn't real, but like it's no more of an issue compared to something like Damping Sphere, which also is like something that, you know, can affect us negatively as well. And I think the good thing about Vexing Bauble is that it has like that out for you. You know, you can crack it and draw a card, and that's something that can be really useful. You know, so like if you play it around it really smartly, I think Vexing Bauble is a really good card. I think it's important when you are playing Vexing Bauble that you always try and, like, especially if you're playing defensively, always try and have at least an Arkham activation available so you can then get a KCI or a Chromatic Orrery to crack it, or hold up 1 mana. So that's like something you really need to make sure you have when you're dealing with Vexing Bauble. But yeah, generally speaking, I think the card quality of Vexing Bauble is a lot higher than Misdirection, especially in the slot meta, and that's worth running. Another stacks piece I've looked at recently is Ubermask. You know, this is a card that says if a player would draw a card, that player removes that card from the game. They exile it face up instead, and each player may play cards that they remove from the game this turn. Essentially, it's shutting off card draw. A, it replaces the card draw effect with an exile, and B, it's like it turns it into like some sort of rummage or loot style thing where you can only access that card for a limited amount of time. So it effectively neutralizes the heuristic study, because every card they draw is something they potentially can't play anymore. You know, this is something, you know, if they exile a breach, that's a card they can't play unless they have a Born Upon the Wind anymore. That's a card that will be gone forever. If they exile a Thoracle, the Thoracle is gone. So like it actually turns drawing cards into a risk for these sloppy decks. So that I think that's a really powerful thing. The only thing stopping me from running it right now, and heck, I might still run it anyway because that's really cool, is that it's 4 mana. You know, it's a really powerful slot piece. I really think they should reprint a more efficiently costed version of this style of effect. It's so powerful. You know, like, I think this is such a cool card. You know, it turns off OBM, which is really cool as well. And if you pair it with Soulless Jailer, it's essentially a lock. You know, they're just locked out of the game. There's a downside to this card. You know, if someone's playing Drannith, they've essentially locked you out of the game in some ways. But if we have an Arkham, we can usually break parity on this anyway. We really don't care about drawing. We really don't care about casting spells from hand once our game plan is online. So this is another great card you should look at. Though that being said, it being 4 mana means that really it's more of a tutor target rather than an early deploy target. And that being said, you might, like, we do run cards like Godfarer Statue, which is really a card we only think about as a piece that you tutor for rather than cast. So I think there's a world where we do go on this, especially if we're on things like Godfarer Statue, which is really only castable under rare circumstances. So I will eventually have a dedicated video on stacks in general, and look, this video's already gone for 52 minutes at this point, so like maybe this is the dedicated video. But yeah, like my recommendations here are, look, Vexing Bauble is like a no-brainer. I think it's really great. Find a slot for it, especially in the slop hell meta, because it's a way to out-economy those economy decks. Ubermask, 4 mana is so rough, girl. Like, I want to run this. It's such a cool card, and heck, I might still try and run it anyway, especially in slop hell. It does stop things like freaking Thrasios, so like it's really cool. And if you are trying to find room for these, think about cutting counter spells first, or yeah, before you cut other things from the toolbox. Anyway, what's the verdict, Mr. Boss? Well, in Turbo Hell, you need to mulligan and cast your answers. That's the most consistent way to survive into mid-game. Having more stack spaces in your deck will help with that. Hate Bears lets you add more stacks without sacrificing precious food slots, so that's a really cool way to find room for things like this. That being said, there are really only 2 Hate Bears that I think are truly worth running that fit within that mulligan to answer plan. In the slop hell meta, stacks is also really powerful as well because it's an economical way to deal with their threats. So that's another reason to consider running stacks as well. So I started this video saying, hey, don't lump us in with those weird Alavir people that play stacks. And now I'm ending the video saying, hey, actually, maybe you should lump us in with that. Maybe we should lean into stacks because it's a very economical way to deal with and neutralize threats. You know, at the end of the day, Arkham is not a good min-range deck. We don't have consistent ways to access those engines. And even if we did draw cards, it wouldn't necessarily translate to an effective control strategy, because so much of our deck is dedicated to permanent spells rather than instant speed interaction. So I think the way that we play defensively is by using stacks pieces at the end of the day. And I think as the threats get worse in this meta, we need to look at better and more economical ways to neutralize those threats. And stacks is the way to do that. Anyway, that's been Zach, otherwise known as Grimpendang, on the Discord. If you haven't jumped on the Discord yet, please do so. It's a great community. You get to hear me talk about my crazy theories, like why I think hate bears are good. And a lot of the ideas for my videos come from the Discord originally. It's a great community of people there, and we'd love to have you there. Anyway, that's all I've got. Thanks for watching.